What we witness today in our democratic institutions, the bitter polarization, the promise of total transformation through political action, the absolute certainty that the right policies will usher in paradise, is not merely political disagreement. It is the manifestation of a spiritual disorder that has infected the very soul of modern democracy. When democratic movements promise to create heaven on earth through the right vote, the correct ideology, or the perfect system, they reveal their Gnostic structure. They have forgotten that authentic democratic order depends upon the recognition of transcendent reality and the humble acknowledgement of human limitation. Today, I want to examine how the Gnostic dream of earthly perfection has corrupted democratic consciousness and what this means for those of us who still understand that true order must be grounded in something beyond the temporal realm. This is not about choosing sides in political battles, but about diagnosing the spiritual sickness that makes all our political battles so desperate and absolute. Chapter 1: The Promise of Earthly Salvation. The fundamental characteristic of Gnostic consciousness is the belief that through special knowledge and correct action, human beings can overcome the basic conditions of existence and create perfect order within history. When we examine modern democratic movements, we find this same structure repeated again and again. Whether from the progressive left promising social justice utopia or the populist right promising national restoration, the pattern remains consistent: politics becomes the means of salvation. This represents a profound corruption of authentic democratic spirit. True democracy, as understood by the American founders, was grounded in the recognition that human beings are fallible creatures who require institutional checks against their own tendency toward tyranny. The separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, the federal system, all these were designed by men who understood that no human institution could achieve perfection and that the attempt to do so would inevitably produce despotism. But Gnostic democracy operates from an entirely different premise. It assumes that the right people with the right knowledge can finally solve the human condition through political action. The complexity and mystery of existence is reduced to a simple formula: identify the oppressors, organize the oppressed, implement the correct policies, and achieve the promised land. This is why our political discourse has become so absolute and apocalyptic. When politics becomes the means of salvation, political opponents become not merely wrong but evil, not merely mistaken but enemies of humanity itself. The Gnostic Democrat cannot accept the tragic dimension of political life, that every solution creates new problems, that every good achieved comes at a cost, that human nature itself sets limits to what political action can accomplish. Instead, they live in a world where total victory is always just one election, one revolution, one more perfect policy away. This creates the manic-depressive cycle that characterizes modern political consciousness: euphoric hope followed by bitter disappointment, leading to even more desperate attempts at political salvation. Chapter 2: The Immanentization of the Eschaton in Democratic Politics. What I have called the immanentization of the Eschaton, the attempt to realize within historical time what properly belongs to the transcendent realm, finds its most sophisticated expression in modern democratic ideology. The Eschaton, the final fulfillment of human destiny, becomes a political program to be achieved through democratic action. Consider how contemporary political movements speak of their goals. They do not merely promise better policies or improved conditions, they promise fundamental transformation of the human condition itself. The environmental movement promises not just cleaner air and water, but a completely new relationship between humanity and nature. Social justice movements promise not just reform of particular injustices, but the elimination of all forms of oppression and the achievement of perfect equality. Economic programs promise not just prosperity, but the end of want and the beginning of universal abundance. These are not political promises in any normal sense. They are Gnostic revelations that claim to possess the secret knowledge necessary to transcend the basic conditions of human existence. The believers in these movements experience themselves as the enlightened ones who have seen through the illusions that keep humanity in bondage. They alone understand the true causes of suffering and possess the means of deliverance. This Gnostic consciousness transforms the democratic process itself. Elections become not exercises in choosing among imperfect alternatives, but cosmic battles between the forces of light and darkness. Political parties become not vehicles for representation and compromise, but armies in a holy war for the soul of humanity. Legislative processes become not forums for deliberation and negotiation, but instruments for implementing the Gnostic vision of perfect order. The result is the destruction of genuine political discourse. When your political program promises to solve the human condition, there can be no legitimate opposition. Those who resist must be either ignorant or malicious. They must be either awakened to the truth or defeated as enemies of progress. The patient work of building consensus, the humble recognition of complexity, the acceptance that reasonable people can disagree about fundamental questions, all of this becomes impossible when politics is conceived as the means of salvation. This is why our democratic institutions are failing. They were designed for citizens who understood politics as a limited activity within a larger order that included family, community, religion, and personal conscience. But Gnostic consciousness demands that politics become total, that it address every aspect of human existence and solve every problem of the human condition. Chapter 3: The Corruption of Democratic Representation. Authentic democratic representation assumes that citizens possess a certain order in their souls that enables them to recognize and choose good leadership. This order depends upon their participation in reality at multiple levels, their experience of transcendent truth through religion or philosophy, their grounding in family and community life, their engagement with the natural world, their appreciation of beauty and culture. A citizen so formed can distinguish between genuine leadership and demagogic manipulation. But Gnostic consciousness destroys this capacity for authentic political judgment. When citizens believe that politics is the means of salvation, they no longer seek representatives who understand the limits of political action and the importance of character and wisdom. Instead, they seek representatives who promise to deliver them from the human condition itself. Take a moment to examine your own experience of contemporary political campaigns. Notice how candidates are marketed not as fallible human beings with particular competencies and limitations, but as saviors who will finally solve problems that have plagued humanity throughout history. The candidate promises to end poverty, eliminate racism, restore America's greatness, heal the planet, or create lasting peace. These are not political promises but Gnostic revelations. The citizens who respond to such appeals have lost touch with the reality that no human being possesses the power to deliver humanity from its basic existential condition. They have forgotten that political leaders are servants of a limited order, not masters of ultimate reality. In their desperate hunger for meaning and salvation, they project onto political figures powers that no human being can possess. This corruption of representation creates a vicious cycle. Politicians learn that they can gain power by making increasingly grandiose promises. Citizens become addicted to the fantasy that the right leader will finally solve all their problems. Neither side has any interest in the truth about what political action can and cannot accomplish. The result is the emergence of what we might call Gnostic populism, movements that claim to represent the enlightened people against the corrupt elite, but which actually represent the Gnostic dream of political salvation against the reality of human limitation. These movements can appear on both the political left and right, but they share the same essential structure, the promise that politics can deliver humanity from the human condition. Traditional democratic theory understood that representatives should be better than their constituents in certain respects, more knowledgeable about public affairs, more experienced in the art of governance, more capable of rising above narrow self-interest for the common good. But Gnostic democracy demands representatives who promise to eliminate the gap between the ideal and the real, between what we hope for and what is actually possible within the conditions of human existence. Chapter 4: The Historical Development of Democratic Gnosticism. The corruption of democratic consciousness by Gnostic symbolism did not happen overnight. It represents the culmination of a process that began with the breakdown of classical and Christian ordering symbols in the late medieval period and accelerated dramatically during the Enlightenment and its aftermath. The American founding represented a remarkable attempt to create democratic institutions while still maintaining connection to transcendent reality. The founders understood that democratic government required what they called virtue in the citizenry, not mere moral behavior, but a spiritual order that recognized the sovereignty of truth over human opinion. They assumed that this order would be maintained through religious institutions, classical education, and the cultivation of what they called natural aristocracy, leadership based on character and wisdom rather than birth or wealth. But already in the founders' generation, we can see the beginnings of the Gnostic corruption. The French Revolution represented the first full-scale attempt to create political salvation through democratic action. The Jacobins believed that they could create a new humanity through the correct application of democratic principles. They would eliminate not just bad government but ignorance, superstition, inequality, and ultimately suffering itself. The failure of the French Revolution did not discredit the Gnostic dream but only refined it. Throughout the 19th century, democratic movements increasingly took on the character of secular religions promising earthly salvation. Socialism promised to eliminate class conflict and create universal abundance. Nationalism promised to create perfect communities united by blood and soil. Liberalism promised to eliminate all barriers to human self-realization through the expansion of individual rights. What all these movements shared was the belief that human beings could transcend the basic conditions of existence through the correct organization of political life. They differed only in their analysis of what was preventing this transcendence and what methods would achieve it. Some blamed private property, others blamed foreign influence, still others blamed traditional institutions or religious superstition. But all agreed that the problem was not in human nature itself but in correctable external conditions. The 20th century saw the full flowering of this Gnostic consciousness in the totalitarian movements of fascism and communism. But it would be a mistake to think that democratic societies escaped this corruption. Instead, they developed more subtle but equally dangerous forms of political Gnosticism. The welfare state promised to eliminate poverty and insecurity. The civil rights movement, while achieving necessary reforms, increasingly took on the character of a Gnostic movement promising to eliminate all forms of prejudice and create perfect equality. The environmental movement promises to heal humanity's relationship with nature and prevent climate catastrophe. Each of these movements contains legitimate concerns and has achieved real goods. But when they take on Gnostic characteristics, when they promise total solutions to existential problems, they become destructive of authentic democratic order. Chapter 5: The Spiritual Emptiness That Drives Political Salvation. The appeal of Gnostic democracy lies not in its intellectual coherence but in its promise to fill the spiritual vacuum created by the collapse of traditional ordering symbols. When human beings lose connection to transcendent reality through religion, philosophy, or contemplative experience, they inevitably seek substitute forms of meaning in salvation. Politics becomes the surrogate religion for souls that have lost touch with authentic spiritual sources. Consider for a moment your own observation of the intense emotional investment that characterizes contemporary political involvement. Notice how political identity has become for many people not merely a matter of policy preference but a source of ultimate meaning. Political movements provide what traditional religion once offered, a sense of belonging to something greater than oneself, a mission that gives life purpose, a hope that suffering will eventually be overcome, and an enemy whose defeat will usher in the promised land. This spiritual hunger explains the religious language that pervades contemporary political discourse. Political leaders are described as prophets or messiahs. Policy proposals are revolutionary or transformative. Electoral victories represent historic moments or fundamental change. Opposition is not merely disagreement but resistance against the forces of darkness. These are not metaphors but expressions of genuinely religious consciousness that has found political expression. The tragedy is that politics, being a limited and temporal activity, cannot provide the transcendent meaning that human souls require. No election can deliver us from mortality, finitude, and the tragic dimension of existence. No policy can eliminate the suffering that comes from being conscious beings in a world we did not make and do not control. No political system can create the perfect community that exists only in the imagination of Gnostic dreamers. But the failure of politics to deliver transcendent meaning does not lead Gnostic consciousness to seek meaning elsewhere. Instead, it produces a demand for ever more radical political action. If this election did not bring salvation, perhaps the next one will. If this policy did not solve the human condition, perhaps a more extreme version will. If this leader proved fallible, perhaps a more perfect one can be found. This creates the manic-depressive cycle that characterizes contemporary political consciousness. The euphoria of electoral victory inevitably gives way to the despair of discovering that political power cannot deliver what was promised. But rather than recognizing the limitations of political action, the disappointed believers conclude that they have not been sufficiently radical, that they have compromised too much with the forces of darkness, that they need purer leaders and more extreme measures. The result is the progressive radicalization of democratic politics. Each political generation feels compelled to promise more than the previous one, to be more uncompromising in its demands, to be more absolute in its denunciation of opposition. The center cannot hold because Gnostic consciousness cannot accept the limited goods that centrist politics can deliver. It demands total transformation or nothing. Chapter 6: The Recovery of Authentic Democratic Order. The recovery of authentic democratic order requires nothing less than the restoration of connection between political life and transcendent reality. This does not mean the establishment of theocracy or the imposition of any particular religious doctrine. It means the recognition that healthy political order depends upon citizens who understand themselves as participants in a reality larger than political life itself. Classical political philosophy understood this relationship clearly. Plato's philosopher kings were not political technicians but souls who had experienced the good and could therefore guide others toward authentic fulfillment. Aristotle's citizens were formed through contemplative and moral practices that connected them to the permanent order of nature and reason. The medieval synthesis integrated classical wisdom with biblical revelation to create a political order that acknowledged both human dignity and human limitation. The American founders attempted to create a modern version of this integration. They assumed that citizens would be formed by institutions, family, church, school, local community, that connected them to sources of meaning transcending immediate political concerns. A citizen so formed could participate in democratic politics without expecting politics to provide ultimate fulfillment. But such formation requires what I have called anamnesis, the recovery of fundamental experiences that modernity has trained us to forget. We must remember what it means to experience wonder at the mystery of existence. We must recover the capacity for contemplation that allows us to participate in truth rather than merely manipulating information. We must restore connection to the natural order that grounds us in reality beyond human construction. This recovery cannot be achieved through political action itself. It requires the patient cultivation of what I call islands of meaning within the larger disorder of modern consciousness. These islands might be families that maintain connection to traditional sources of wisdom, educational institutions that preserve classical learning, religious communities that practice authentic spiritual discipline, or simply individuals who commit themselves to the philosophical life. The hope for democratic renewal lies not in finding the perfect political system but in the emergence of citizens who understand the proper relationship between political and spiritual order. Such citizens can participate in political life without expecting it to provide ultimate meaning. They can work for limited improvements without believing that perfect solutions are possible. They can oppose injustice without falling into the Gnostic dream of eliminating all suffering through political action. This understanding enables what we might call contemplative citizenship, participation in political life informed by philosophical and spiritual discipline. The contemplative citizen recognizes that political order reflects the order or disorder of souls, and therefore works primarily on the formation of consciousness rather than the manipulation of external institutions. Such citizenship requires intellectual courage, the willingness to think through fundamental questions rather than accepting ideological formulas. It requires spiritual discipline, the cultivation of practices that maintain connection to transcendent reality. Most importantly, it requires the recognition that our primary responsibility is not to save the world through political action but to order our own souls in accordance with truth. Chapter 7: Practical Resistance to Gnostic Democracy. Resistance to the Gnostic corruption of democratic consciousness must begin with the recognition that this is fundamentally a spiritual rather than a political problem. The ultimate source of political disorder lies in the disorder of souls, and therefore our primary task is the restoration of spiritual order in ourselves and those within our sphere of influence. This resistance takes several concrete forms. First, we must cultivate the practice of intellectual honesty about what political action can and cannot accomplish. When political leaders promise to solve problems that are rooted in the human condition itself, poverty, conflict, suffering, death, we must have the courage to recognize these as Gnostic fantasies regardless of how appealing they might be. Second, we must recover the practice of contemplation that allows us to participate in reality beyond the immediate urgencies of political life. This might mean returning to classical texts that preserve the wisdom of ages past, engaging in religious practices that connect us to transcendent reality, or simply cultivating the habit of philosophical reflection about fundamental questions of human existence. Third, we must resist the totalizing tendency of Gnostic consciousness that demands that every aspect of life be politicized. We must preserve spaces, in family life, in friendship, in intellectual pursuits, in aesthetic experience, that exist for their own sake rather than as instruments of political transformation. These spaces serve as reminders that human fulfillment comes from sources other than political action. Fourth, we must practice what I call contemplative resistance to the emotional manipulation that characterizes Gnostic politics. When political movements attempt to generate hysteria by claiming that this election, this policy, this leader represents the ultimate battle between good and evil, we must maintain the intellectual and spiritual distance necessary to recognize the limited nature of all political choices. This does not mean withdrawal from political life or indifference to political questions. It means participation in politics from a position of spiritual strength rather than spiritual desperation. The citizen who understands that ultimate meaning comes from sources beyond politics can engage in political action without being consumed by it. Such resistance often requires standing alone against the enthusiasms of the moment. When Gnostic movements reach their peak intensity, they create enormous pressure for conformity. To question their promises of salvation, to point out the limitations of political action, to insist on the tragic dimension of human existence, all of this will be seen as betrayal of humanity's highest hopes. But this is precisely when resistance becomes most necessary. History shows us repeatedly that Gnostic movements, when they gain sufficient power, inevitably produce results opposite to their stated intentions. The promise to create heaven on earth consistently produces various forms of hell. The attempt to eliminate suffering through political action multiplies suffering. The effort to achieve perfect equality creates new forms of tyranny. The contemplative citizen who maintains distance from these enthusiasms serves as a witness to permanent realities that Gnostic consciousness tries to forget. By refusing to be swept up in the latest promise of political salvation, by insisting on the importance of character over ideology, by maintaining commitment to truth over partisan advantage, such citizens preserve the possibility of authentic political order even in ages of widespread spiritual disorder. Conclusion. The Gnostic corruption of democratic consciousness represents one of the greatest spiritual challenges of our time. When politics becomes the means of salvation, political life itself becomes corrupted and authentic democratic order becomes impossible. The promise to create heaven on earth through democratic action inevitably produces various forms of hell. But this recognition need not lead to despair. The truth about authentic order cannot be permanently destroyed, and in every age there are those who maintain connection to the permanent sources of meaning that ground healthy political life. Our task is to become such people ourselves and to create the conditions in which others might recover this connection. The hope for democratic renewal lies not in finding the perfect political formula but in the emergence of citizens who understand that politics is a limited activity within a larger order that includes family, community, culture, religion, and personal contemplation. Such citizens can participate in political life without expecting it to provide ultimate fulfillment, and therefore can engage in the patient work of building authentic order rather than chasing Gnostic dreams of earthly paradise. The choice before us is clear: we can continue to pursue the Gnostic fantasy of political salvation, or we can recover the wisdom that understands political order as the external expression of the order of souls. The future of democratic civilization depends upon which path we choose.